Grown men were dying in their sleep. Perfectly healthy, they would wake screaming from nightmares, so terrified to close their eyes again that some stayed awake for days until their exhausted bodies gave out and they died in the middle of a dream. That really happened, and a struggling horror director read about it in the newspaper. This is A Nightmare on Elm Street, Wes Craven's 1984 classic starring Heather Langenkamp, Robert Englund, and a teenage Johnny Depp, about a burned killer who murders you inside your own dreams. Today, we count down 20 weird facts and stick around for number 1 because this cheap little horror film went on to build a Hollywood empire. Subscribe and comment your favorite Freddy kill. Let's get into it. The single most disturbing fact about A Nightmare on Elm Street is that its central premise was real. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Los Angeles Times ran a series of articles about a wave of mysterious deaths among Southeast Asian refugees living in America, many of them from the Hmong community. Otherwise, healthy young men were dying in their sleep, apparently in the grip of violent nightmares, with no medical cause anyone could identify. The phenomenon was real enough to earn a clinical name, sudden unexpected nocturnal death syndrome. One story in particular lodged itself in Wes Craven's imagination. He described reading about a young refugee who had become terrified to sleep, insisting that something was chasing him in his dreams and that it would get him if he closed his eyes. The boy stayed awake for as long as he could. When he finally collapsed into sleep, his family thought the worst had passed. Then, in the middle of the night, they heard him screaming, and by the time they reached him, he was dead. He had died inside a nightmare. Craven turned that single, real, unexplained horror into Freddy Krueger. The visual foundation of Freddy Krueger, that shambling, menacing figure in the battered fedora, came directly from a genuinely frightening moment in Wes Craven's own childhood. When Craven was around 10 years old, he was looking out the window of his family's apartment when he noticed a disheveled man, by most accounts a drunk or a vagrant, stopped on the sidewalk below in a shabby coat and hat. What made the memory stick was what happened next. Somehow, sensing he was being watched, the man slowly looked up and stared directly into the eyes of the young Craven with an intensity the director described as deeply malevolent. Terrified, Craven jumped back and sat on the edge of his bed, waiting for the man to move on. When he crept back to the window, the stranger was still there, still staring up at him. That shambling figure and that hat became the seed of Freddy's entire appearance decades later. A childhood fear preserved and weaponized into one of horror's most recognizable silhouettes. Freddy Krueger's name was not invented from thin air either. It was assembled from pieces of Wes Craven's own past and preoccupations. The first name, Campermerikunutz, came from a boy named Fred Krueger, a schoolmate with whom Craven had shared a paper route as a child, and who reportedly bullied him for years. Craven took the name of his childhood tormentor and attached it to the monster who would go on to terrify millions. The surname carried extra weight too. Craven had already used a version of it once before, naming the villain of his brutal 1972 debut The Last House on the Left Krug. So Krueger was in part an extension of that earlier creation. And Craven has said the name simply sounded right to him for a figure of menace, noting that Krueger struck his ear as distinctly German and even reminded him of the name of a fearsome warplane from the Second World War. A bully, an earlier villain, and a vaguely militaristic menace all fused into 2 words. Freddy's filthy red and green striped sweater is one of the most iconic costumes in horror, and its colors were chosen with genuinely scientific precision. Wes Craven has explained that he read an article in Scientific American around 1982 reporting that red and green happen to be among the most difficult color combinations for the human eye to process when placed directly against each other, creating a subtle, almost physical sense of visual unease in the viewer. Craven seized on this deliberately. He wanted Freddy to be unsettling to look at on a level below conscious thought, so that even a brief glimpse of the killer would leave audiences vaguely uncomfortable without quite knowing why. Interestingly, the sweater was not always going to be those colors. In the original script, it was described as red and yellow, a nod to the comic book character Plastic Man, another figure who could reshape his body. It was only after reading about that clashing red and green effect that Craven changed it, turning a simple costume into a low-level assault on the retina. There is a related piece of hidden craft worth noting. For all that the film is titled A Nightmare on Elm Street, and for all that the address 1428 Elm Street looms over the story, the words Elm Street are reportedly never actually spoken aloud by any character at any point in the entire movie. Craven built an atmosphere of dread out of what the audience sees and half senses rather than what it is told directly. And the sweater is the purest example, a threat you feel in your eyes before your brain ever catches up. A Nightmare on Elm Street was Johnny Depp's very first film, and he landed the role of Nancy's doomed boyfriend Glenn almost entirely by accident. Depp, then an unknown aspiring musician around 21 years old, had not come to audition for anything. He had simply accompanied a friend to the audition, and that friend was a young actor named Jackie Earle Haley, who decades later would go on to play Freddy Krueger himself in the 2010 remake. The decisive moment came down to teenage taste. Wes Craven took Depp's headshot home and showed it, along with the other candidates, to his daughter and her friend, both around 14 years old. They immediately picked Depp, telling Craven the young man was dreamy and that he simply had to cast him. Craven, who had noticed Depp's strange magnetic quality despite the actor looking like he had not showered in days and having fingers stained yellow from cigarettes, agreed. A superstar career was launched because two teenagers liked to photograph. Depp's involvement also ties to one of the film's enduring real-world curiosities. The house used as Nancy's home, the fictional 1428 Elm Street, is an actual private residence located at 1428 North Genesee Avenue in Los Angeles. It still stands today and has become a genuine pilgrimage site for horror fans who travel from around the world to photograph the ordinary suburban home where a young Johnny Depp was famously swallowed by his own bed. The real owners have lived alongside that fame for decades. Before Johnny Depp was cast, the role of Glenn was offered to a different young actor who was, at the time, a far more bankable name, Charlie Sheen. Sheen was seriously in the running, but the deal collapsed for two reasons. The first was money. His representatives reportedly demanded roughly double the weekly wage the production was offering, a sum around $1,100 a week that the desperately low-budget film simply could not stretch to cover. The second reason has become darkly funny in hindsight. Sheen himself later admitted that he passed on the film largely because he did not understand its appeal or believe in it. By his own account, he told Craven something to the effect that he just could not picture the whole concept working. A killer in a funny hat with a rotted face, a striped sweater, and a bunch of clacking metal fingers, and he flatly did not see it catching on. That killer went on to become one of the most enduring horror icons of all time, and Sheen had waved him away as a non-starter. For a character who dominates the entire franchise and became a household name, Freddy Krueger is remarkably scarce in the film that introduced him. Across the whole of the original A Nightmare on Elm Street, Robert Englund's Freddy actually appears on screen for only a handful of minutes, a very small fraction of the film's total running time. He is felt everywhere, dreaded constantly, and glimpsed only briefly. This scarcity was a large part of the character's power. By keeping Freddy mostly in shadow, half seen and always just out of reach, Craven made him feel like a genuine nightmare rather than a conventional slasher who stalks fully visible through every scene. The restraint built almost unbearable tension and left audiences desperate for and terrified of each brief appearance. It is a lesson later sequels arguably forgot, as they pushed Freddy front and center and turned him into a wisecracking star. In the original, his menace comes precisely from how little of him you actually get to see. Robert Englund's performance as Freddy is so definitive that it is nearly impossible to imagine anyone else in the role, yet he was far from Wes Craven's initial plan. Early on, Craven envisioned Freddy as an older figure and reportedly pursued the distinguished British character actor David Warner, well known to horror fans from films like The Omen, to bring a certain aged gravity to the part. That casting fell through. Even more surprising, Craven at one point did not intend to cast a traditional actor at all, because so much of Freddy's menace is physical. The shambling walk, the sudden lunges, the looming presence. Craven initially considered simply hiring a stuntman to embody the killer. He tested several, but came to realize that the role demanded genuine acting to work, a real performer who could inject dark personality into the character. Robert Englund won the part on the strength of the unsettling energy he brought to his audition, and in doing so quietly became one of horror's greatest icons in a role nobody had planned to give a real actor. He was surrounded by a cast with quietly impressive pedigrees. John Saxon, playing Nancy's police lieutenant father, was a veteran leading man who had shared the screen with Bruce Lee in Enter the Dragon. And Ronee Blackley, who plays Nancy's troubled, alcoholic mother, had earned an Academy Award nomination for her work in Robert Altman's celebrated 1975 film, Nashville. A tiny horror film that could barely make payroll had, in its supporting ranks, an Oscar nominee and a co-star of one of the most famous martial arts movies ever made, anchoring the young unknowns at its center. Two of the most jaw-dropping death scenes in A Nightmare on Elm Street, Tina being dragged up a wall and across the ceiling, and the notorious geyser of blood from Glenn's bed, were achieved with the same ingenious and expensive practical set. The crew built an entire bedroom mounted on axles so that the whole room could physically rotate a full 360 degrees, with all the furniture nailed firmly in place. The inspiration was, of all things, a classic musical. Craven took the idea from the 1951 Fred Astaire film Royal Wedding, in which Astaire famously appears to dance up the walls and across the ceiling of a room, an effect achieved by rotating the set around the camera. For Tina's death, the technique let her killer appear to drag her impossibly up the wall. To film inside this spinning contraption, Wes Craven and his cinematographer were reportedly strapped into car seats bolted to the wall so they could operate the camera while the entire world turned around them. That single clever set produced the film's two signature nightmares. The rotating room was also, by the standards of this threadbare production, staggeringly expensive, reportedly costing around $35,000 to build. A huge slice of the film's tiny overall budget spent on a single piece of equipment. The team squeezed every possible use out of it. Beyond serving both Tina's death and Glenn's blood geyser, the room was later rented out to other productions to help recoup the cost, including, in a delightfully incongruous footnote, the 1984 breakdancing sequel, Breakin' 2, Electric Boogaloo, the most nightmarish set in horror moonlighted in a dance movie. One of the film's most genuinely frightening moments comes when Freddy's clawed glove rises up out of the bathwater between the legs of an exhausted Nancy, before dragging her down beneath the surface into an impossible, endless underwater void. The staging of that terrifying image required a clever bit of practical trickery that most viewers would never guess. The bathtub Nancy dozes off in was specially built with no bottom to it. This bottomless tub was then constructed into a bathroom set that had been erected directly over a swimming pool. When Nancy is pulled under, she is not being dragged into a magically deepened bathtub at all. She's being pulled down through the open bottom of the tub into an actual pool of water beneath the entire set, which is why the space below feels so vast and drowning. For the underwater portion of the sequence, Heather Langenkamp was swapped out for a stunt woman who could safely perform the submerged action. A simple hole in a tub over a pool created one of horror's most claustrophobic scares. We are halfway through the nightmare, and the 10 strangest facts are still ahead, including a near electrocution and the ending Wes Craven never wanted. If you are enjoying this descent into one of the greatest horror films ever made, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me the scariest dream you can actually remember. Alright, back to Elm Street. The single most spectacular effect in the film is the death of Johnny Depp's character, Glenn, in which Freddy pulls him down into his bed and the mattress erupts, spewing an enormous geyser of blood all the way to the ceiling. It was created by inverting that same rotating room, flipping the whole bedroom upside down and pouring gallons of red liquid downward, so that once the image was flipped right side up, it looked like a fountain blasting upward. Across the entire production, reportedly over 500 gallons of fake blood were used, with a huge portion in this one shot. The scene very nearly ended in genuine catastrophe. According to those on set, the grips rotating the room pushed it in the wrong direction, and with all that liquid sloshing unpredictably inside, they lost control of the spinning mechanism entirely. Heather Langenkamp described a 2-inch tsunami of fake blood flooding across the soundstage floor, which was, like every soundstage, covered in electrical cables. The liquid hit a light and electrified the water, mildly electrocuting a crew member, while Robert Englund reportedly grabbed his young co-star and ran to get clear of the spreading, charged flood. The film's most beautiful effect almost hurt somebody for real. There is a moment of pure nightmare logic in the film when Nancy, fleeing Freddy, tries to run up the stairs of her house only to find the steps have turned soft and gluey beneath her feet, trapping her as her pursuer closes in. It is a perfect evocation of that universal dream sensation of being unable to run, and it was accomplished with the cheapest possible ingredients from a kitchen. The production was operating on such a shoestring budget that the crew's motto, by their own recollection, was essentially figuring out how to do everything at rock bottom prices. For the sticky steps, they lifted the top surface off to the staircase and filled the space beneath with a mixture of ordinary oatmeal and pancake batter, which turned genuinely, stubbornly sticky when left to sit. They even color matched the gooey mess to the carpeting, so it would read on camera as the stairs themselves melting into muck. One of the film's most memorable dream images was, in reality, breakfast food. In one of the film's earliest and most surreal, frightening moments, Freddy pursues Tina down a dark alley and suddenly extends his arms to an impossible, inhuman width, his claws scraping against the walls on either side of the passage, far too far apart for any human body. It signals immediately that the rules of reality do not apply to this monster, and the effect was created with almost comically simple stagecraft. Rather than any complex mechanical or optical trick, the crew simply attached a set of long, fake extended arms to Robert Englund, and then positioned men on either side of the alley holding fishing poles. Using the poles like puppeteers working a marionette, they manipulated the elongated prop arms to make them sway and reach menacingly as Freddy advanced. It is the kind of resourceful, hands-on solution that defined the entire production. A genuinely eerie and dreamlike image produced by a couple of crew members with fishing rods standing just out of frame. The film is full of these scrappy technical firsts and tricks. Craven has said he was told that A Nightmare on Elm Street was the very first movie to use a breakaway mirror, the kind that shatters safely on camera for one of its dream sequences. Time and again, the production solved impossible-looking dream imagery not with money it did not have, but with pure ingenuity, fishing poles, kitchen ingredients, spinning rooms, and homemade gags, which is a large part of why the film still feels handmade and genuinely unsettling in a way slicker, more expensive horror often does not. Tucked into A Nightmare on Elm Street is a small, affectionate nod to a fellow independent horror filmmaker that kicked off a friendly tradition between the two directors. In one scene, a television set in the film is playing Sam Raimi's 1981 splatter classic The Evil Dead. This was a deliberate tribute from Craven and a return of an earlier favor. The exchange had started with Raimi. In The Evil Dead, Raimi had included a poster for Wes Craven's film The Hills Have Eyes as a small tip of the hat. Craven repaid the gesture by featuring The Evil Dead on the TV in his own movie, and the back and forth did not stop there. Sam Raimi, in turn, later hid Freddy Krueger's distinctive clawed glove in a scene in his sequel, Evil Dead 2, where it can be spotted hanging in a workshop. This playful game of mutual references, buried across multiple films, became a beloved piece of trivia for horror fans and a mark of genuine respect between two masters of the genre. In Craven's earliest conception of the character, Freddy Krueger's backstory was even darker and more disturbing than the version that reached the screen. As originally written, the crime that got Freddy killed by the vengeful parents of Elm Street was child molestation, making him a predator rather than strictly a murderer. Craven ultimately changed this, rewriting Freddy's history so that he was a child killer instead. The reason for the change was a matter of conscience and timing. Craven reportedly grew concerned because, around the period the film was being made, there was a wave of highly publicized real-life child abuse cases in the news. He did not want his fictional monster to seem as though it was cheaply exploiting genuine, ongoing tragedies affecting real families and real children. By shifting Freddy's crime, Craven kept the character monstrous while stepping back from a real-world horror he felt should not be used for entertainment. It is a rare example of a horror filmmaker deliberately making his villain's backstory less exploitative out of respect for actual victims. A Nightmare on Elm Street was born out of a genuinely low point in Wes Craven's life, not a position of creative strength. After his groundbreaking 1970s horror films, Craven had hit a difficult, unsuccessful stretch. By his own accounts and those close to him, he was broke, had gone through a divorce, had no steady paychecks coming in, and was struggling personally. He wrote the Nightmare script largely out of sheer financial desperation, hoping it could get him working again. Getting anyone to make it proved almost as nightmarish as the film itself. Craven's idea that a killer could murder you inside your dreams was rejected all over Hollywood for years. Even his friend Sean Cunningham, the producer behind the wildly successful Friday the 13th, reportedly did not believe the dream premise would work with audiences. Studio after studio passed on it. The film that would become one of the most influential horror movies ever made spent a long time as an unwanted script written by a desperate man turned away at nearly every door in the industry. The desperation went deeper than money alone. Craven has spoken about how much of himself went into the film, and years later, he would return to the world of Elm Street in an unusually personal way. His 1994 film, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, reunited him with Heather Langenkamp and blurred the line between the actors and their roles, partly inspired by a real and frightening experience Langenkamp herself had endured with an obsessive stalker. The franchise that began in Craven's lowest, most desperate hour eventually circled back around to become one of the most self-aware and personal horror projects of its era. The famous final scene of A Nightmare on Elm Street, in which Nancy's apparent victory dissolves into one last cruel shock as the killer proves to still be in control, was not what Wes Craven wanted at all. Craven had written a cleaner, more thoughtful ending in which Nancy simply defeats Freddy and walks out into a bright, ambiguous morning, leaving the audience to quietly wonder about the dreamlike nature of it all. It was conclusive, and it put the monster to rest. That conclusiveness was exactly the problem for producer Robert Shea, the head of New Line Cinema, who could see the potential for a lucrative, ongoing franchise and did not want Freddy killed off permanently. Shea pushed hard for a twist that would keep the character alive and the door open for sequels. Craven strongly objected, and the two clashed bitterly over it, a disagreement that reportedly damaged their relationship for years. The theatrical ending was a compromise between their two visions, but it was Shea's commercial instinct, the desire to keep Freddy on his feet, that ultimately shaped how the film leaves its audience. The specific gag that ends the film, in which Nancy's mother is suddenly yanked backward through the small window of the front door by Freddy, arriving as part of that forced twist ending, has a genuinely funny secret behind it. To achieve the shot of the mother being pulled through the door, the crew tied a rope around a mannequin dummy standing in for the actress and had several grips inside the house yank it through on cue. By all accounts, the resulting effect looked absurd. The stiff dummy went shooting through the door window in a way that struck everyone present as ridiculous rather than frightening. And the crew, including Robert Englund, reportedly could not stop laughing at how silly it appeared on set. And yet they kept it in the finished film anyway. The effect amused everyone involved so thoroughly that, by their own admission, they simply could not bring themselves to cut it, leaving a moment that even its own makers found unintentionally comedic sitting inside one of the most influential horror endings ever shot. The film very nearly collapsed financially in the middle of its own production. The company backing it, New Line Cinema, was at the time a small fledgling operation that had until then only distributed other people's films rather than producing its own. And A Nightmare on Elm Street represented an enormous gamble for the little firm. It was operating with almost no margin for error. Then, during filming, the situation became genuinely dire. New Line's distribution arrangement for the movie reportedly fell through, and the money dried up so completely that for around 2 weeks the company was simply unable to pay its own cast and crew. Everyone working on what would become a horror landmark carried on through a stretch where their paychecks had effectively stopped, with the whole enterprise teetering on the edge of falling apart entirely. That the film was finished at all, given how close the money came to vanishing mid-shoot, is a small miracle in itself. Here is the extraordinary final legacy of this small, cheap, nearly bankrupt horror movie. When A Nightmare on Elm Street was released, it was a massive success, earning back its tiny budget almost immediately and going on to gross many times what it cost. In doing so, it did far more than launch a franchise and an icon. It essentially saved and made the fortunes of New Line Cinema, the struggling little company that had gambled everything to produce it. The film was so foundational to the studio's survival and rise that New Line became widely and affectionately known throughout the industry as the house that Freddy built, and that house grew into a giant. Over the following 2 decades, New Line Cinema transformed from a scrappy outfit that could barely pay its crew into a major Hollywood studio. One powerful enough to finance and release one of the most ambitious and celebrated projects in film history, Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. The epic journey to Mordor was bankrolled by a studio that a burned man in a striped sweater had rescued from oblivion. Freddy Krueger, in a very real sense, helped pay for Middle-earth. So there you have it. 20 weird facts about a horror masterpiece ripped from real, unexplained deaths, dreamed up by a broke and desperate filmmaker, and rejected all over Hollywood before a nearly bankrupt studio took the gamble. Its scares were built from pancake batter, fishing poles, and a bathtub over a swimming pool. Its star was cast because 2 teenagers liked his photo, and its success went on to help fund the journey to Middle-earth. Not bad for a man in a dirty sweater who barely appears on screen.